Hello, everyone. Welcome into another episode of Bolt Breakdowns here on the Guilty as Charged podcast YouTube channel. We are here after the Chargers are able to knock off the Raiders 24-17. A lot of stuff to talk about in this game, including Herbert's hand, another fourth down call to debate on Twitter. We have an historic Khalil Mack game, which was really fun to watch. And the fourth thing that I wrote on my notes was Jerry Tillery. So I assume we'll talk about that at some point if I have time. But I do want to, say first of all, off the bat, it was really important for the Chargers to get back to 2-2 after how they started the season with two close losses to Miami and Tennessee. They now put themselves in a better position going forward, potentially being able to, obviously you'd like to beat Dallas, you'd like to beat Kansas City, but obviously going into those games being at 1-3 or 0-4 would have been a potential death sentence on the season. And I would say that the Chargers, from that aspect, off the bat, they've stabilized their season in that way. However, there are some aspects that are very unstable, such as the amount of injuries. Joey Bosa, Austin Eckler, Derwin James all didn't play in this game. And now we have one more injury to add into that as we head into the bye week with Justin Herbert's hand. So that's where I kind of wanted to start. I guess this will just be, sort of a Herbert segment plus talking about his hand. I thought Herbert ultimately played a pretty good first half. The pressure was flying in his face from the beginning of the game. And credit to Max Crosby, credit to all those guys because they were just like flying at him. It didn't feel like this was the best day from a pass blocking standpoint from the offensive line. No egregiously bad performances, but like I think Pipkins allowed 4 pressures. I think Slater allowed 2. This wasn't like it was just you're going against Max Crosby. He's going to get his. He's a top 5 edge in the game. But it did really feel like the pressure affected how the Chargers kind of call their offense in this game. And we'll talk about that on the Herbert play where he did get injured. It just in this game in general, it felt like the Chargers, when they could avoid the pressure and stabilize everything on that crazy completion that Herbert got to Quentin Johnston, where, that was actually a Crosby rep win against Slater. And he somehow falls like backwards out of the pocket and then somehow completes that ball to Quentin Johnston after getting hit. So in the first half, I did feel like there were a lot of moments from Justin Herbert where, he was doing a good job at kind of dealing with the pressure and everything that was coming in his face. And there was a lot of it the whole game. So in that standpoint, I felt, obviously the Chargers were kind of aided by the Aidan O'Connell turnovers, right? That set them up in good positions in the red zone, right? You can't eliminate how the offense performed in terms of getting 24 points without talking about that. Because you look at the box score, it's like, well, Justin Herbert had 167 yards. And if you take away the Darius Davis play, they got 100 yards on 36 carries, right? So somehow the offense had to move. And obviously it was partially because of the play of the defense. And I would also say, because of, some of the plays Herbert made in the first half and miscommunications on the Raiders end as well. But yeah, I guess moving on to the second half, I did think, they go 3 and out that first drive. And then the second drive, of course, of the third quarter was when Herbert rolls out of the pocket because he's flushed. He did have Keenan Allen open, but the Raiders kind of flushed him before he saw that. And then, of course, he, just kind of throws essentially kind of an arm punt at that point to Joshua Palmer because they kind of needed to get something, or he could have thrown it away, I guess. But as he's throwing that ball in the process of the play, his hand does get stepped on. And that's going to be the biggest story for the Chargers kind of going forward, even coming out of this win. Now, Herbert comes back the next drive. He's wearing a splint. It was a pretty extensive splint if you watched on the broadcast or just saw a picture of it. It looked pretty gnarly is what I will say. And Herbert kind of tried to play it off in the post game when Daniel Popper asked him about it and was like, hey, what's up with your hand? He was like, oh, it's just a flesh wound. I don't think it's just a flesh wound. Something, is clearly kind of more wrong with that hand than, oh, he just cut it and he'll be fine, right? And you could tell it because of how the Chargers ran their offense the rest of the game. Herbert, in the remaining 2 or 3 drives of that game, has 1 snap from under center, and it was, the QB sneak, which we'll get to in a minute. So you could tell that the Chargers were running their offense differently because of whatever injury happened to Herbert. He comes out of the blue tent. I don't know if this is going to have long-term consequences, for the Chargers. So I don't want to speculate too much as we go into the bye week. Obviously, I think in the next coming days, we'll probably have more information about like kind of what this Herbert hand injury is and what a timeline is, what his prognosis is, so on and so forth, and how this will affect the Chargers in games going forward. But to me, that's the biggest storyline like coming out of this game, because going into Dallas, going into Kansas City with a healthy Herbert versus an injured Herbert, obviously a very big difference. And it kind of, as we saw in this game, like I just mentioned, limits what you can call on offense, right? If Kansas City knows that you're going to play mostly in shotgun the whole day because of Herbert's hand, and it really is limited, if any of these teams kind of can sense that, then they're going to adjust how they play defense accordingly as well. If, Herbert isn't quite as ready to do as much stuff at the line of scrimmage, running to pick up first downs, et cetera, right? So, from that standpoint, that is worth noting going forward. So wish all the best for Justin Herbert. I hope that hand isn't injured or isn't as hurt, but it's definitely the storyline to kind of watch going into this week. So hope everything is okay. But clearly, I think when you talk about the offensive performance in this game too, they have a pretty good performance in the first half, took advantage of some Aidan O'Connell turnovers, and you kind of can't talk about the second half except for the first drive where they went 3 and out. Outside of that, all the drives were affected by what happened on the Herbert interception. So, it's kind of hard to judge their offense when that was something that was hanging over it, right? In terms of judging Kellen Moore's performance and all these things. I want to talk about the 4th and 1 call. I also want to talk about the ASJ interception. Let's talk about the 4th and 1 call first. Last week I came on the show when we talked about the Minnesota call on 4th and 1 to run it with Joshua Kelly. And I said I liked the decision. I didn't like the play call because they should have QB sneaked it. This week they QB sneaked it and I didn't like it. Honestly, I like the decision to go for it on 4th and 1. But I thought that the decision was much more up in the air in terms of what the Chargers could have done here, because obviously you have to take into account Herbert's injury in real time. And, if they had punted, I wouldn't have personally blamed them, because obviously you're dealing with an injured Herbert. They decided to QB sneak it, and I'm not going to be effusive in my, outrage about that play call, because look, I can't sit here and pretend like I wasn't the guy asking them to go for QB sneak, and all of Twitter and everyone was asking them to go for a QB sneak instead of what they did last week. So I can't, be mad at them or be as mad at them, given, what we just discussed. But I do think you have to take into account how the game's going and also Herbert's hand, right? And the announcers talked about it when Herbert first came back into the game. It's like, look, if you have guys on the other side of the defensive line, it's not a dirty play. It's just football. They're going to chop at that hand, as much as they can. Right. And that's just part of the game. So I think that was the thing that I kind of struggled with in terms of how the Chargers offense was running. The rest of the game, obviously they were pretty compromised by that. But on that 4th and 1 in particular, if the option was QB sneak versus punt, or, try a passing play, whatever it might have been, or even run the ball, I probably, just out of the aspect of protecting Justin Herbert, and, considering that this was a team that after Justin Herbert had cracked his ribs last year, was so protective of him when that happened in the weeks that he, kind of healed from that. I just didn't think the 4th and 1. I thought the 4th and 1 call was fine. I would have been fine going for it there, although the math and the analytics was not as in the Chargers' favor. They still said go for it, but the numbers were not quite as supportive of the decision as they were last week, because all of the analytical models said go for it, versus this week it was a little bit up in the air. But I'm fine with the 4th and 1 decision to go for it. I will kind of always defend Staley on that basis, especially when in situations where the other team has to score a touchdown to tie or win, versus the Browns game last year, right, where versus a field goal wins the game. And I didn't like that decision to go for it there, because the Chargers kind of compromised themselves So, 4th and 1, I'm fine with the decision to go for it, but the QB sneak in that moment, I don't know if I really want to like blame Moore or blame Staley, as extensively, maybe as the play call last week against the Vikings, but I just think they should have taken the Herbert thing into account and figured out something else to do, whether that involved a passing play, whether that involved punting it, whether that involved just handing it off to Joshua Kelly, even if that probably wouldn't have worked. I just think you have to protect your premium asset in that situation more importantly than like doing everything to get the first down, especially considering how wrong that play could have gone if, again, like even if Herbert picks it up or something happens and his hand winds up on the bottom of the pile and like, suddenly something happens, right? So for me, that was my feelings on the 4th and 1 call. The other thing that I thought was interesting was when Asante Samuel Jr. Was, shadowing Davante Adams. He gets the pick on Aidan O'Connell when the Raiders sort of set up and get the ball back. And then Brandon Staley is on the sideline, and he told Asante Samuel Jr. to go down. Right. So, I mean, that was pretty clear on the TV angle. I don't know how fans in the stadium interpreted it, but it was pretty evident if you watched even the TV angle, not even the all 22, that Brandon Staley told Asante Samuel Jr. to go down. I thought it was just weird because Asante probably had a lot of yards in front of him. This wasn't a JC Jackson situation where JC runs it out of the end zone, and then that ends up costing the Chargers because Miami scores with Tyreek Hill as soon as they get the ball back. He seemed to have some, green room in front of him, and maybe it was just a kind of a misread of the situation on ASJ's part too, to not realize again what the stakes of the game were at that point and how many timeouts the Raiders had plus the 2-minute warning. Maybe it was on him, but Staley also seemed to aggressively indicate that he wanted Asante Samuel Jr. live in the moment to go down. And I just thought that was weird given the situation they were in, because again, more field position, more breathing room. Kind of would have been easier for the Chargers to probably, close out the game than it ended up being, because it took a 51-yard bomb from Herbert to Josh Palmer to kind of, put the final nail in the coffin on the Raiders. If that's not complete or Palmer drops it or something, the, Chargers, if it was an incomplete pass and stops the clock, then the Raiders have a chance to, again, get the ball back, right? Didn't end up mattering, but I just thought it was something that was worth pointing out, especially when we did talk so much about JC Jackson taking the ball out of the end zone in week 1, how that costed them, and how adamant they were about Asante going down there. I thought was weird given the state of the game at that point. It wasn't over, right? So I didn't really understand quite how that happened. Now that I've kind of talked about everything, that happened in the second half that was a little bit weird, I want to give credit to Khalil Mack. That's the next thing that I think we have to talk about. Khalil Mack, 6-sack game, tons of pressures, QB hits, run stops. He was a beast in this game. And look, I think if you're honestly kind of looking about each sack, you could nitpick, one after the other and just go, oh, well, Illuminor fucked up on that one, and that was a stunt, so he didn't read that properly. But ultimately, this is the game that we all were kind of begging Khalil Mack to have. I don't think Khalil Mack to state will ever be the pass rusher he was in Chicago or with Raiders back in 2016 when he was Defensive Player of the Year and all that, and he and JJ Watt were the 2 best edge players in the league, right? I don't think Khalil Mack at his age is ever going to get back to that, but if he can have moments like this where he's just able to push his way through and have a great game, it's not going to result in 6 sacks every game, and some of that is on the Raiders, like I mentioned. But it just needs to be a little bit, we need this assertive Mac a little bit more, especially with no Joey Bosa in this game. Thule, not as great of a pass rushing game as he had in weeks 2 and week 3, right? So this was a very necessary Khalil Mack game to have, and he's, forcing fumbles, terrorizing poor Aidan O'Connell, who just has to kind of stand there and take it back in the pocket. So yeah, I thought that this, Khalil Mack, in addition to the secondary playing well and much better than they had in weeks past, I thought that this was, just a historic game for him. And I don't think it should be lost, just how good it was, right? Just in terms of how he was beating up on guys and finally had that kind of like vintage game as a Charger. There was the game against the Raiders last year, and I think that you could argue which one was better in terms of the week 1 against the Raiders or week 4 against the Raiders this year. But just put Silver. Maybe we should just tell Khalil Mack, hey, the Raiders are playing this week. So remember when John Gruden traded your ass? All right, now, now get set for the snap. So that it just does feel like every time he plays the Raiders, it does feel like he's got a little bit extra. So maybe the Chargers can also harness that a little bit when he plays the Bears in a couple weeks too. Although that seemed to be a little bit more of an amicable separation. So, but ultimately, awesome stuff for Khalil Mack in this game, in a game where the Chargers needed him to kind of, be Khalil Mack, that we all know, again, because of, Joey Bosa with the toe in the hamstring and Tuli not having quite as effective of a game, more of a run stopping game for Tuli in this one, where he actually was pretty effective as a run defender, and the Chargers were pretty effective on run defense as well. But they needed Khalil Mack to have the game he did. Sebastian Joseph Day to have the game he did. So ultimately, probably the most complete effort from beginning to end that I can remember from the defensive line, just in terms of always being there in the pass rush and being there in run defense as well. Probably the best effort from them on the season when all things considered. Some of that, again, is the Raiders' O-line. Some of that's Aidan O'Connell. But I think all the credit in the world has to go to Khalil Mack, especially with how much we probably criticized him in the first 2 weeks of the season, given everything that had, transpired. And it just felt like he wasn't quite getting the same pressures that he did, even though he wasn't facing, elite tackles per se. So I did think this situation, again, the Raiders dropped back a lot and kind of helped the Chargers in terms of getting pass rush pressure, but this was the game that you needed to see from Khalil Mack. Defense-wise, other kind of notes that I guess I would say I had on the defense. J.C. Jackson was active for this game, but I don't think he registered a coverage snap, if I'm not mistaken, based on the numbers. Maybe he, did get some kind of defensive snap. I certainly didn't see it if he did. I don't remember any particular moment where the cameras like panned to him on the sideline. So he was active in this game and he was in uniform, but I didn't see the Chargers use him. I don't think at all. I'm curious what the final snap numbers end up being, but look, it seems like whether JC Jackson is active or not in a specific game week, Brandon Staley is pretty set on this Michael Davis and Asante Samuel Jr. duo being their main guys on the outside. And I think for all factors considered, that is the right decision. Like I talked about last week, I talked about JC kind of ad nauseum, but the experiment has pretty clearly failed. And I think you just kind of have to salvage whatever is left of the season, right? And if Asante Samuel Jr. and Michael Davis are playing the level at which they have the last 2 weeks, then don't fix what ain't broke. And maybe an injury happens to Asante at some point. Maybe an injury happens to Michael Davis that forces JC back into action. But I think you just kind of have to keep rolling with what's working. And clearly that 3-man cornerback group the first 2 weeks just never really, hit its stride for the Chargers. And there were a lot of reasons as to why. But nonetheless, I did think that ASJ and Michael Davis were really good in this game, especially with the safety room kind of being in tatters and having to start Dean Marlowe and having to start Raheem Lane and play AJ Finley. For this game to go as well as it did for the secondary. Yeah, again, like I said, some of that's Aidan O'Connell, and you could, put a lot of asterisks on it if you wanted to. But the Chargers were also heavily banged up at going into this game with Bosa and Derwin and Alohi and JT all being hurt. And they come away with this solid of a defensive performance in the secondary. So as much as flack as I've given Staley's secondary the last 3 weeks, I can't say that this wasn't a good performance, right? This was a really good, really complete performance. And it's nice to see Michael Davis play pretty well, all things considered, on Devontae Adams. I thought he had Asante obviously had a couple good reps on Devontae as well. Devontae's going to get his. I think he ended up with 75 yards, and you can't talk about this game without talking about him falling on his shoulder and having to leave the game at some point as well. But overall, I did think that this was a pretty good defensive performance from the Chargers, all things considered. Now, how much of this is translatable is the question, right? When we talk about going into Arrowhead. Is there week 7 game in Arrowhead or in LA? I think it's in Arrowhead. And playing Patrick Mahomes, playing the Cowboys on Monday Night Football. How much of this is going to be translatable? I don't think Dallas is going to give up 6 sacks per se. And, obviously the quarterback play is going to be at a higher level than Aidan O'Connell. It's going to be a better quarterback wearing number 4 on Monday Night Football. So, but I think you still take the positive signs from this game. Plus, they should have Derwin James back. They should have Joey Bosa back on Monday night. So those are kind of my notes on the defensive side of the ball. Overall, very good thing, all things considered. It wasn't the hardest game to prepare for, but I still think, considering the state of the defense the first 3 weeks, it was just nice to see them have a normal game. Couple undisciplined moments. The Josh and Jacobs 3rd and 18. The Asante Samuel Jr. unnecessary roughness penalty on Hunter Renfrow. But overall, all things considered, pretty good effort. Talking about the offense. Again, it's kind of impossible to talk about the offense without talking about the turnovers committed by the Raiders or Herbert's injury in the 3rd quarter. But I mean, overall, I think things were kind of schemed well, right? It just kind of, the plays never seemed to fully execute. Darius Davis got a big 51-yard run, but the Chargers as a whole weren't able to run the ball most of the day. I think they had 36 carries for about 104 yards if you take that Davis play out. So they had averaged, a little over, close to 3 yards per carry, but it just wasn't as efficient with Joshua Kelly and Isaiah Spiller and Herbert running whenever he had to. So kind of a weird game to judge from that rushing standpoint, but this was a game where the Chargers did miss Austin Eckler. That much, because whenever the pressure's in Herbert's face too, and the Raiders are sending the house or whatever, right? Austin Eckler is so much of that guy who's in the flat and he's willing to take a ball, then he takes the ball 30 yards after the catch, right? We've just seen Austin Eckler do that again and again. And I think that's kind of what the Chargers have lost with Joshua Kelly having to play the role that he has in these last few weeks of being the lead back. Defenses no longer have to consider the, threat that Eckler is in the passing game, right? With him missing time. So I do hope he's back after the bye week. I think that's a lot of kind of their offensive dysfunction right now. I think we really undermine week after week how important Eckler's gravity kind of is to this offense. And so I do feel like they missed him in this game. And then Herbert and Joshua Palmer and Quentin Johnston. Obviously, he gets the big throw to Joshua Palmer at the end. I think there was a Palmer drop somewhere in there. Quentin had a drop. It just felt like in this game, there is still that symptom of only 24 throwing attempts. So, how do we kind of really justify who he trusts and who he doesn't? But it feels like without Mike Williams, and this is what I'll talk about in terms of missing him, the receivers that Herbert really trusts are Keenan, Gerald Everett, Donald Parham is one. I think he trusts Palmer. Obviously, you don't throw that ball in the end without trusting Josh Palmer to some extent. But, Josh Palmer obviously isn't as efficient as the player that Mike Williams is, and the caliber receiver that he is. That's not a diss on Josh Palmer, just it is what it is. So I do feel like the Chargers are still kind of learning to play without Mike Williams. And that's going to be a process that probably extends for a while for the Chargers until they kind of get Quentin more healthily involved, kind of get Josh Palmer more in the flow of things. That's going to continue. I think Keenan Allen probably could have had a bigger game than he did, but there just weren't that many opportunities for him to do so based on how everything offensively played out. He had 32 yards in the first half, probably could have had more. And then obviously Herbert's injury. So it's kind of hard to judge his performance, but he was playing pretty well out there. I did think that this was going to be a game where Keenan Allen had 100+ yards and really ran away from the Raiders, but just kind of didn't end up playing out that way. So that was more, I think, situational than anything to really criticize Allen or Herbert for in that regard. So yeah, I would say that this was a good enough offensive performance to get the job done in this game against this Raiders team. But I would like to see things cleaned up and hopefully this team gets Eckler back. Hopefully this team kind of figures out the wide receiver dynamics and maybe gets Gerald Everett a little bit more involved. Next game, they tried to get Donald Parham involved a couple times and, just kind of got, they used him on the goal line. Just plays didn't work. So, I don't think this was like the um, worst game in the world for the Chargers offensively. Like, I think that's how some people talk about this game because of how the second half played out. But again, like, you can't talk about the second half without mentioning the Herbert thing. And I don't envy Kellen Moore's position in that moment to then have to kind of like throw everything out the window and like figure out what's going to work. So that I do think will be something to watch going forward is like, is Herbert's hand healthy enough by time they play Dallas to in week 6 to, be able to effectively run the offense as he was in the first half of this game, in the Minnesota game at that level. Right. And so that's going to be the biggest storyline kind of for the Chargers going forward. But yeah, let's talk about Jerry Tillery, man. Jerry Tillery gets thrown out of this game because of a late hit on Justin Herbert. And it was one of the most like atrocious hits I've ever seen. And I want to say this so bad. Jerry Tillery was one of the worst players that I ever had to root for as I did this podcast. Like, I hated every second of rooting for that guy because he made these boneheaded plays and boneheaded decisions all the time. And we just kind of had to accept it because he's a Charger. And so it's like, we can't like say that he sucks every week. Even though we kind of still did end up saying he sucks every week, as a run defender and as a pass rusher, man, like the way that he plays football is just so unlikable. And Max Crosby is even like talking to Herbert on the field, like after it happened, almost in a way where it was like, we don't know what they said, but it felt like he was almost apologizing to Herbert for what happened to Tillery. It was like, yeah, that guy, I don't know what's up with him, but he's just kind of, he's on the team, but I don't know if we accept him necessarily as one of us. So the Tillery thing, like, and again, this happened consistently when he was on the Chargers too. Like Tillery was like the king of late hits in some circumstances, right? He decked Josh Allen in 2020, like 15 seconds after the play ended. Did the same thing to Mac Jones in 2021, where the whistle's long blown dead, and he comes in there and says, "I'm Jerry Tillery," and has his unnecessary roughness, roughing the pass, or whatever you want to see, that cost the Chargers big time. And like, I just like, I was so happy when they cut that guy last year, and I'm happy that I don't have to watch him. But it was also nice to see the team jump to Justin Herbert's defense. Scott Matlock is like the first. Scott Matlock never even played with Jerry Tillery, and he's the first one off the bench. And they get into this like mini brawl that gets cooled off on the sideline. But it was just nice to see them all like essentially agree, and they all crapped on him after the game. They were like, yeah, that was a cheap shot. That sucked. That guy stinks. I've never seen quotes that were like quite that direct, which again makes you wonder Tillery in the locker room and what that was like. But yeah, everyone, Sebastian Joseph Day, Khalil Mack, like all those guys were like, yeah, that was a punk move. Like that sucked. So yeah, just I'm so happy that Jerry Tillery is no longer a Charger. I'm happy that he is someone else's problem. This is the player that he was for all 3.5 years that he was on the Chargers before he was cut. And if he had not been a day one pick, like everything that we talked about with Jerry Tillery would have happened so much sooner, right? Like he probably would have been cut earlier, but they always wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt. And the thing that I just kept consistently saying was like, the breakout's not coming. This guy's not going to work. And so it was, it sucked to see him do that late hit on Herbert. And I'm happy he wasn't injured on that play because we would be having a whole lot of an angrier discussion about what happened to Justin Herbert. But yeah, Jerry Tillery sucks. That's the point of this bit in the podcast. But that guy, like, he cannot play football. He cannot play football. He's not efficient at doing anything, really. And he totally deserved to get thrown out of that game. I think he deserves to get suspended. Like, you just cannot do that on the sideline. And I don't know if they're actually going to suspend him, but man, Jerry Tillery was not nice knowing you when you were a Charger, not nice knowing you as a Raider, but we got the win. you lost. So suck it. Uh, I guess that's my final bit that I'm going to end the show on. I wanted to sneak the Jerry Tillery bit so no one sees it in the first 5 minutes. But yeah, ultimately, look, the Chargers stabilize their season. They get to 2-2. We'll talk about the Chiefs and Cowboys games after the bye. Next week, I am planning on doing a bye week Q&A probably for my episode. So I will reach out for questions on Twitter and YouTube, and we'll talk about everything as the Chargers are standing in the bye week. So that'll go up probably next Monday. But yeah, things feel good right now. The vibes are better than they were at 0-2. The vibes are still questionable sometimes with some of the things that will still happens and a lot of the injuries that exist on this team, but they have a chance to go into the bye week, get healthy, and then have some big games against Dallas and Kansas City. So we'll see what happens there going into the break. Thank you guys for watching. And as always, no, I'm not going to say bolt up. Fuck the Raiders.